The message hit his screen like a sledgehammer. Frankie, the boss Malone, the notorious gambling kingpin of Chicago, stared at the words with wide eyes, his hands trembling. The screen flickered as his heart raced. You've been warned, Frankie. You've been playing with fire. I know about you and Marie. I know everything. The words sent a chill down his spine. It was the kind of warning that could mean only one thing. He was in deep trouble. Marie. She had been nothing more than a temptation at first. A gorgeous, mysterious woman who had slipped into his world like a dream. Smooth, seductive, and everything Frankie wanted. He didn't even know why he'd gotten involved with her. She'd seemed so perfect, so out of reach. Yet somehow, they had started talking, first on a casual chat platform, then exchanging private messages that were charged with chemistry. Over time, things got steamy. Too steamy. But now, everything had spiraled out of control. The affair was no longer a secret, and her husband, who had never seemed to be anything more than a quiet shadow in the background of her life, was now at the center of everything. The mobster. Frankie had never been afraid of anyone. At least, he hadn't been before this. He had run his empire with power and an iron fist, and had made countless enemies, but none had ever made him feel so exposed. As he stared at the screen, his mind raced. What was she playing at? Was she in danger too? And why did she tell him, after everything, that her husband knew? Did she want out? Or was she just toying with him? He sat back in his leather chair, eyes glued to the screen, mind spinning. The last message she had sent him was simple yet devastating. If you value your life, Frankie, you need to disappear. I can't protect you from him anymore. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. His world, which had been perfectly constructed, was now on the brink of collapse. What could he do? Should he run? Should he confront Marie's husband? Or should he pretend none of this ever happened? The click of his office door startled him. His eyes darted over to the entrance, and his heart skipped a beat. Standing in the doorway was his most trusted enforcer, Mike, the Bear, Harris. Mike was a big guy, a silent type with the strength of a bulldozer. His presence alone commanded respect. "Boss," Mike said gruffly, his voice heavy with concern, "we got a problem." Frankie felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to steady his breath. Mike stepped forward, closing the door behind him. "We've been hearing whispers, Frankie. Word is, someone's been asking around about you. And there's something strange going on with your accounts. You need to watch your back." Frankie's mind raced. He had dealt with shady characters before, but none of them had ever made his skin crawl like the thought of Marie's husband did. He had heard rumors about the mobster, Tony, the snake Russo. People said he was a ghost, impossible to track, dangerous beyond reason, and absolutely ruthless. He suddenly understood what Marie had meant. Tony had found out. Frankie's pulse quickened. There was no way out now. "What do we do?" Frankie asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We lay low for now," Mike said, his eyes scanning the room as if he expected someone to jump out at him. "We need to figure out what Tony wants. If he wants you out, we'll need a plan." Frankie nodded, his mind still on Marie. What had she gotten him into? Why hadn't she told him sooner? And now, as if on cue, his phone buzzed again. "I'm so sorry, Frankie. I didn't know it would end like this. Please, just get away. I'll keep him distracted as long as I can." His heart sank. He needed to make a decision, and fast. Would he run, or would he fight back? Before he could answer, the room grew silent. The phone buzzed once more, but this time, it wasn't from Marie. It was an unknown number. Frankie hesitated for only a second before answering. "Who is this?" Frankie's voice was harsh, demanding. There was a pause on the other end. Then, the cold voice of a man who seemed too calm for the situation said, "You don't know me, but I know you, Malone. And I'm not the one you should be worried about." The blood drained from Frankie's face. "Who is this?" he repeated, his heart hammering in his chest. The voice chuckled darkly. "You'll find out soon enough, boss." Click. The line went dead. Frankie's grip tightened around the phone. Something told him his nightmare was just beginning. Frankie sat still, the phone trembling in his hand. He had been in close calls before, had felt the icy grip of danger more times than he cared to count. But this was different. This felt like he was at the edge of a cliff, and the wind was ready to push him off at any moment. He turned to Mike, his enforcer still standing in the doorway, watching him carefully. What the hell was that? Mike just shook his head, his jaw tight. Could be anyone. But whoever it was, they're not playing games. Frankie leaned back in his chair, his mind swirling. Who could it be? Someone from his past? A rival? Or worse, someone connected to Tony Russo? The possibilities made his head spin. But one thing was clear. Whoever this was, they knew too much about him. I don't like this, Mike, Frankie muttered, running a hand through his hair. I don't like it one bit. Mike stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, lowering his voice. Boss, I think we need to take a different approach. We can't just sit here waiting for whatever happens next. We need to find out who this is, and fast. Frankie nodded, his mind already racing. Right. You and the boys start looking into this. Dig deep. Find out who's been sniffing around. Mike gave him a sharp nod. You got it. As Mike left the office, Frankie was left alone with his thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything was spiraling out of control. His empire, the one he had built from the ground up, was teetering on the edge of collapse, and he had no idea how to stop it. Then, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Marie. It was brief, but it made his stomach drop. I think he's onto us. Be careful. Don't trust anyone. Frankie stared at the screen, his heart pounding in his chest. Don't trust anyone. The words echoed in his mind. Was she warning him about the mobster? Or was there something else going on? He didn't know who to trust anymore. Not even Marie. He quickly typed a response. What's going on? What do you mean? But before he could hit send, a knock on his door interrupted him. Boss, we've got a situation. Mike's voice came through the door urgent. Frankie quickly shoved his phone into his pocket and stood up. What now? Mike entered, looking more serious than ever. We've been tracking the phone number that called you earlier. It's connected to a burner phone, but we've traced the location to a building on the west side. It's an abandoned warehouse. Frankie's stomach tightened. That's not far from where Tony Russo's men usually hang out. Exactly, Mike said grimly. We think this might be where the danger's coming from. They're trying to lure you out. Frankie's eyes narrowed. We go in, quietly, find out who's behind this, and we deal with them. Mike hesitated. Boss, you sure about this? We don't know who we're walking into. It could be a trap. Frankie didn't flinch. I'm sure. I can't wait around for them to make the first move. I need answers, and I'm getting them tonight. Mike nodded reluctantly, signaling to the other men. All right, let's move out. Frankie felt the weight of the decision hanging heavy in the air as he followed Mike out of his office. This was it. No more waiting. No more playing it safe. He was going to find out what was really going on with Marie and her husband. The drive to the warehouse was tense. The city streets blurred by, and Frankie's thoughts churned in overdrive. What could this all mean? Why had Marie told him that Tony knew about the affair? Was she truly trying to protect him, or was there something more sinister at play? They pulled up to the warehouse, its dark silhouette looming in the distance. Frankie gave Mike a sharp nod, signaling to keep quiet. The men moved swiftly, ducking into the shadows as they approached the building. Frankie's mind raced with possibilities, his pulse quickening with every step. They reached the side door, which was barely ajar. Frankie motioned for Mike and the others to stay back as he crept inside. The air was thick with dust, and the floor creaked under his weight. His heart was pounding in his chest. He had no idea what he was walking into, but he was ready for whatever came next. As he moved deeper into the warehouse, he heard voices, low, muffled voices. Frankie motioned for the others to stay put as he crept closer to the source. The voices grew clearer, and Frankie froze in place, straining to listen. She's not the only one, a man's voice said, too quiet to make out the rest. Frankie's eyes narrowed. He recognized that voice. It was Tony Russo's. His breath hitched. This was bigger than he thought. Suddenly, the sound of a door slamming open made him jump. Frankie turned to see a figure moving toward him in the shadows, someone he hadn't expected to see. Marie. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with panic. "Frankie, you shouldn't be here," she whispered urgently. But before Frankie could respond, a sharp voice cut through the silence. "Did you really think you could sneak around behind my back, Malone?" Frankie's blood ran cold as he turned to see Tony Russo stepping out of the darkness, a smug grin on his face. This was it. The trap had been set, and Frankie had just walked right into it. The mobster's eyes locked onto Frankie's. "It's time to settle things once and for all." The room felt like it was closing in. Frankie had no way out. The tension in the warehouse was thick enough to cut with a knife. Frankie's breath caught in his chest as he stood face to face with Tony Russo, the man whose name alone could send chills through the entire city. Marie stood frozen beside him, her hands trembling as she glanced nervously between the two men. Frankie didn't move. He couldn't. He knew Tony was dangerous, but in that moment, the threat seemed almost secondary to the burning questions in his mind. How had Tony found out? Was Marie involved? Had she been playing him the whole time? Tony's grin grew wider, though there was no humor in it. "You really think you're untouchable, huh, Frankie? I've been hearing whispers about you for a while now, and you thought you could just sneak around with my wife?" Marie's eyes welled with tears. "Tony, please, this isn't what you think." Tony's eyes flicked to her, the affection in them cold and cruel. "Shut up, Marie. You've already said enough. This is between me and Mr. Malone now." Frankie's mind raced. He wasn't about to back down. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. "You've got it all wrong, Russo," Frankie said, his voice steady, though his insides were twisting. "This was never supposed to get this far. I didn't know you were going to find out, and I sure as hell didn't want this to go public. But I'm not afraid of you." Tony laughed, low and menacing. "You should be." Before Frankie could respond, he heard the sharp click of metal against metal. A gun. Frankie's heart skipped a beat as he realized the situation was far worse than he had anticipated. Tony pulled out a gun, a sleek silver revolver that gleamed under the dim lights of the warehouse. He leveled it at Frankie without hesitation. "You've got two options now, Malone. You can either walk out of here and forget about Marie, or, well, you can join the pile of bodies that thought they could cross me." Marie stepped forward, her eyes pleading with Tony. "Tony, don't. Stay out of this, Marie." Tony snapped, cutting her off with a glare that could freeze blood. Frankie's mind spun. There was no way he was going to back down from this. But what could he do? He had no weapon, no backup, and the odds were stacked against him. His hands slowly rose in surrender, though his mind was already calculating his next move. "You're making a mistake, Russo," Frankie said, his voice unwavering. "You really think you can just end this over a woman?" Tony's smile didn't falter. "It's not about her, Frankie. It's about respect. You disrespected me, and now you pay the price." Frankie's eyes darted around the dimly lit warehouse, looking for anything, any way out. The door was too far. His men were out of sight, and it was just him, Tony, and Marie in this standoff. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, the sound of a door slamming open. Frankie's heart leaped into his throat. "Freeze. Hands up." A new voice, deep and authoritative, filled the room. Frankie turned toward the entrance. Standing in the doorway was a figure he hadn't expected to see. It was a police officer, but not just any officer. This man was dressed in plain clothes, a badge dangling from his neck, his expression cold and steely. And behind him, several more uniformed officers stepped into the room, guns drawn. "Tony Russo," the officer said, his voice calm but commanding, "you're under arrest for the murder of Vincenzo Lombardi, extortion, and a dozen other charges." Tony froze, his gun still pointed at Frankie. "What is this?" he spat, the arrogance in his voice replaced with genuine confusion and anger. Frankie stood motionless, his mind racing. This wasn't what he'd expected at all. The officers weren't here for him. They were here for Tony. "Put the gun down, Russo," the officer said again, stepping forward. "This is over." Marie's eyes darted between Tony and the officers. "Tony, they're here for you," she whispered in disbelief. Tony's eyes narrowed, his grip on the revolver tightening. But before he could make a move, One of the officers lunged forward, disarming him with practiced ease. Within seconds, Tony was cuffed and shoved to the ground. Frankie's heart was still pounding, but a small part of him couldn't help but feel a rush of relief. He wasn't going to die tonight. He wasn't going to be taken down by a mobster's rage. The lead officer approached Frankie slowly, his gaze never leaving him. "Malone," the officer said, his voice clipped, "you're lucky. But don't think this means we're done with you. I know who you are, and we'll be keeping a close eye on you." Frankie nodded, trying to steady his breath. "I wasn't planning on making your job harder, officer. But it looks like I'm in the clear for now." The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned toward Marie. "Ma'am, you're going to need to come with us. We'll need your statement." Marie's face went pale, and she took a hesitant step back. "What about Frankie?" she asked, her voice trembling. The officer looked at her, then at Frankie, before shaking his head. "Right now, it's Tony Russo we're after. You both need to come with us." As the officers led Tony out of the warehouse in cuffs, Frankie and Marie stood in the silence that followed. Marie's eyes were red, her face etched with fear and confusion. She turned to Frankie, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't know, Frankie. I swear I didn't know Tony was going to." Frankie held up his hand, cutting her off. "It doesn't matter now, Marie. What matters is we're both alive. But this is far from over. You need to figure out what side you're really on. And so do I." As the sirens of the approaching squad cars wailed in the distance, Frankie realized the game had changed. The stakes had gone up, and now, he was caught between two worlds. The one he'd built, and the one he'd never truly escaped. And just when he thought he was in the clear, a new thought chilled him to the bone. Was the arrest of Tony Russo part of a bigger plan? Or was someone else pulling the strings, waiting for the right moment to finish what they'd started? One thing was certain. The worst was far from over. Frankie sat in the back of a police car, staring out the window as they drove through the dark streets of Chicago. The lights from the police cars blinked on and off, making everything feel even more intense. Marie, the woman he had been secretly seeing, sat next to him. She looked nervous and sad. Frankie didn't know what to say to make her feel better, so he kept quiet. He kept thinking about what had just happened. Tony Russo, the dangerous mobster, had been arrested, but the police weren't just after him. They were after Frankie, too. They said they knew Frankie was connected to the crime world, but he wasn't sure if that was true. What if someone was framing him? When the police car stopped at the station, they were led inside. The building was quiet. He didn't want to get in trouble for things he hadn't done, but Jameson was making it hard to explain. He thought he had been careful, but maybe he had made a mistake. "I'm not working with anyone," Frankie said quickly. "You're wrong. I've got nothing to do with Tony Russo." But the detective wasn't buying it. "We've got all the proof we need. We know you're mixed up in things you shouldn't be. Now, we can either put you behind bars, or you can help us. We want Tony Russo, and we know you can help us catch him." Frankie felt trapped. The police were offering him a way out, but it didn't feel right. Helping them might get him out of trouble, but would it put him in even more danger? Tony Russo was a dangerous man, and Frankie didn't want to make things worse. Marie looked at Frankie, her eyes full of worry. "Please, Frankie, don't help them. You don't know how bad Tony can get." Frankie turned to her, feeling torn. He wanted to help her, but he also didn't want to end up in even more trouble. His head was spinning. Before he could answer, the door opened again. Another officer stepped in, looking serious. "Detective, you need to come see this." Jameson gave Frankie one last look before following the officer out of the room. Frankie didn't know what was going on, but he had a bad feeling about it. Marie shifted nervously in her seat, but Frankie stayed still. He needed to know what was happening outside that room. What was the police officer talking about? The door creaked open again, and this time, it was Mike, Frankie's right-hand man. Mike was big and tough, and when he walked into the room, he looked even more serious than usual. "Boss, we've got a problem," Mike said in a low voice, his eyes darting around the room. "You need to come with me." Frankie felt his stomach tighten. "What's going on?" he asked, standing up. Mike didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned and motioned for Frankie to follow him. The two of them walked quickly down the hall, past officers, and through the quiet station. Frankie's heart raced, not knowing what was waiting for him. Had something happened to Tony Russo? Or was it something even worse? Mike stopped in front of a door and opened it, revealing another officer inside. "Boss, there's something you need to see." The officer looked at Frankie with a mix of surprise and worry. "It's bad. Very bad." Frankie stepped inside, confused. The officer quickly turned on a screen, showing a live news broadcast. "Breaking news," the announcer's voice boomed. "Chicago mob boss Tony Russo has been taken into custody, but authorities are now investigating a shocking new twist. Sources say there may be more dangerous figures involved in the case than originally thought, and one of them may be someone already close to the investigation." Frankie's blood ran cold. Was he being accused of something even worse than he realized? Just as the news report continued, the sound of hurried footsteps approached. Frankie turned around to see Detective Jameson walking back into the room, his face grim. He looked at the screen and then at Frankie. "You're not in the clear, Malone," Jameson said, his voice cold. "We thought we were just dealing with Tony Russo, but now we know there's something much bigger going on." Frankie's mind raced. Had the detective figured out that there was someone else pulling the strings? Someone even more dangerous than Tony Russo? Before Frankie could respond, the door slammed open, and the voice of a man he didn't expect to hear echoed through the room. "I don't think you're going anywhere, Malone." It was Tony Russo's voice, and Frankie had no idea how Tony could be speaking from the prison. But he knew one thing for sure. Things were about to get a lot more complicated. Frankie froze, his body tense, as he heard Tony Russo's voice coming from nowhere. It wasn't possible. Tony was in custody. How could he be speaking like this? The officers in the room were just as confused. Detective Jameson's face tightened, and he quickly motioned for one of the officers to check the phone lines and equipment. Everyone started scrambling, but Frankie felt something cold creep up his spine. He had been in tight spots before, but this felt different. Tony Russo, even locked up in a police station, was still controlling the game. Then, the voice came again, loud and clear, this time from a nearby speaker. "You thought you could just lock me up and forget about me, huh, Malone?" Tony's voice sneered. "You're not even out of the woods yet. You think Detective Jameson can protect you? Think again." Frankie's heart raced. He knew Tony had connections, but this was something else. Whoever was helping Tony had the kind of power that made even the police nervous. He looked over at Jameson, who was now speaking to his officers in hushed tones, trying to figure out how Tony was communicating with them from jail. The officer closest to Frankie turned to him, eyes wide. "How is he doing this? Is this one of your men?" Frankie shook his head. "I don't know what's going on. I'm not in contact with him. But whatever he's got planned, we need to be careful." Before the officer could reply, the speaker crackled again, and Tony's voice rang out once more, low and threatening. "Frankie, you might think you've outsmarted me, but I'm still in control. I've got eyes everywhere, even in that fancy police station. You should have stayed out of my business. Now you're both tangled up in something you can't escape from. You don't have much time." Frankie's mind was racing. Tony was always one step ahead. But this? It was almost like Tony was playing a whole different game, one that Frankie didn't know the rules to. The officer behind Frankie muttered, "This is bad. We need to figure out how he's doing this fast." Jameson finally spoke, his voice sharp. "Get back to work. We're not letting this go. Russo wants to play games? We'll play right back. But I don't want to hear another peep out of him until we figure out how he's doing it. Got it?" Frankie could feel the tension in the air. There was no way Tony was just sitting in jail quietly. He had something planned, something that could tear everything apart. He could feel the weight of it in the pit of his stomach. A few minutes of uneasy silence passed as the officers worked frantically to figure out how Tony was pulling this off. Frankie didn't trust the police, but right now, they were the only ones standing between him and Tony's endless web of danger. Marie, who had been standing quietly in the corner, finally spoke, her voice shaky. "What if Tony's not just trying to scare us? What if this is just the beginning?" Frankie turned to her, his mind spinning. "It could be, but I can't think of anything else. Right now, we need to keep our heads down and let Jameson do his thing. We're in deep, and if I don't play this right, We're both going to get swept up. Marie nodded slowly, but Frankie could see the doubt in her eyes. She didn't believe that everything would be fine, and neither did he. The door to the room suddenly opened, and Detective Jameson stormed back in, his face dark. All right, we've got a situation. Russo has some kind of system set up. He's got a person on the inside, feeding him information. We can't trace the source, but we've figured out that he has eyes on us. On you, Malone. Frankie's stomach sank. Tony wasn't just making threats. He was watching everything, every move they made. He's too powerful, Jameson continued, slamming his fist on the table. But there's no way out of this without a plan. We need someone on the inside. Someone who knows how he operates. Frankie thought about it for a moment. The police were right. They needed someone who could break into Tony's system. But that person couldn't be someone like Detective Jameson. It had to be someone who could move in and out of the underworld, unnoticed. Frankie looked at Marie. You're the only one who can do this. I know you're scared, but I don't see any other way. Marie shook her head quickly. No, I can't. I don't even know how he's pulling this off. I don't know if I'm strong enough. You've been living with Tony. You've seen how he works, how he gets to people, Frankie urged. I know it's dangerous, but we need to get inside his operation, see what's really going on. You've got the best chance of doing that. Marie bit her lip, clearly torn. The weight of the decision hung in the air, and Frankie could feel it. It was too big a choice, one that could either free them both or get them both killed. Jameson, who had been watching the exchange quietly, added, She's right, Malone. If we don't have someone on the inside, we can't stop Russo. We can't even figure out how deep his operation goes. And you can bet that once he's out of jail, he'll be coming after you, Marie. The room was silent for a long moment. Frankie watched Marie as she wrestled with her fear. He knew she was scared, but he also knew she was tough. She had to be. Finally, she looked up at him, her eyes full of determination. I'll do it. I'll go back in. But we have to make sure we're ready. I'm not walking into this without a plan. Frankie's heart pounded in his chest. He had no idea what would happen next, but he knew they didn't have a choice. If they wanted to bring down Tony Russo, it had to be done from the inside. As Marie stood up, ready to take on the dangerous mission, Frankie knew that everything was about to change. They were now in a race against time, with the lives of both of them hanging in the balance. The question was, would they survive the game Tony Russo had set in motion? The plan was risky, and Frankie could feel the weight of it in his chest. Marie, though scared, was determined to do whatever it took to get out of this mess. Frankie wasn't sure if this was the best idea, but he couldn't see another option. If they didn't act fast, Tony Russo would find a way to take them down, one way or another. After agreeing to help the police, Marie had started preparing for the dangerous mission. They weren't just facing Tony. They were up against his entire network, and that was a whole different kind of fight. Tony had eyes everywhere, and now that he knew Marie was working with the police, there was no telling how far he would go to make sure she didn't succeed. Frankie and Detective Jameson had worked out the details. They'd set up a plan where Marie would pretend to return to Tony's side, using her inside knowledge to gather whatever information they could. The problem? Tony wouldn't believe it so easily. He would want to test her loyalty, and if she slipped up, she could be dead before anyone could stop it. As the hours passed and the plan came together, Frankie sat in the dark, nervously watching Marie. She had dressed in the clothes she knew Tony liked, the same ones she'd worn when they first met. Her hair was styled just like it had been during their affair, and she looked every bit the woman who belonged by Tony's side. You sure you're ready? Frankie asked, his voice low as he walked over to her. Marie took a deep breath, her hands shaking just slightly. I don't have a choice, Frankie. I can't live like this anymore. I'll be here, he said, giving her a tight smile. But you've got to trust yourself. You're the only one who can make this work. Marie looked at him for a long moment. Then, without saying anything, she turned and walked out the door. Frankie watched her disappear into the night, feeling his stomach twist into knots. It was out of his hands now. He just had to hope that Marie's courage was enough to bring them the answers they needed. Meanwhile, inside the heart of Tony Russo's operation, everything was tense. Tony's men were on high alert after the police had raided some of his businesses. He was furious. But he had a way of turning anger into something more dangerous. He couldn't risk being locked up again, and that meant he needed to be in control, no matter what. Marie arrived at Tony's main hideout, a large, old building hidden in a forgotten part of the city. She was greeted by a few of Tony's enforcers, who looked at her with suspicion. Her heart raced as they searched her, checking to make sure she wasn't hiding anything. "Tony's expecting you," one of the guards said, giving her a cold look. Marie nodded, forcing herself to stay calm as they led her to Tony's office. She knew she couldn't let her guard down, not even for a second. Tony had a way of reading people, and if he caught even the slightest hint of doubt, he'd know something was off. As they opened the door, she stepped inside, and there he was. Tony Russo, sitting at his massive desk, looking as powerful as ever. His dark eyes narrowed when he saw her. Well, Tony said, his voice smooth but dangerous. "I was wondering how long it would take you to come crawling back." Marie stood still, forcing a smile. "I'm here, Tony, just like I promised." Tony leaned back in his chair, studying her. "I hope you're not playing me, Marie, because if you are, things won't end well for you. I've got people watching, everywhere." Marie's pulse quickened, but she kept her cool. "I'm not playing you. I'm here because I belong with you. No one else can understand you like I do." Tony's eyes flicked to the side for a moment, his mind clearly working. "I hope you're telling the truth, because if I find out you're lying, well, you'll wish you were never born." Marie didn't flinch. She knew Tony was testing her. He needed to feel secure again, to know that he still held the power. "I'm not lying," Marie said firmly. "I'm with you, Tony. Always." Tony finally smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a smile that told Marie everything she needed to know. The game was just beginning. He hadn't fully trusted her yet, and he was going to push her to see how far she would go. "I like hearing that," Tony said, standing up, "but I need to be sure. You know how this works, Marie. If you want to stay in my world, you need to prove it. Prove it by doing what needs to be done." Marie's stomach sank. She knew exactly what he meant. Tony would want her to do something horrible, something that would either prove her loyalty or get her killed. There was no middle ground with him. "I'll do whatever it takes," Marie replied, her voice steady. She didn't want to admit it, but deep down, she was scared. Would she be able to play Tony's game without losing herself in the process? Tony stared at her for a long time, then nodded. "Good, because I'm going to need your help with something. There's a rat in my organization. I want you to find out who it is." Marie's heart pounded. This was bigger than she thought. Tony wasn't just testing her loyalty. He was asking her to betray someone she didn't know. The consequences of failing would be catastrophic. She had no choice but to say yes. "I'll find out who it is," Marie said, trying to keep her voice calm, even though her mind was racing. Tony looked satisfied. "I knew you would. Don't disappoint me." As Marie turned to leave, her mind swirled with the terrifying possibilities. She had just agreed to help Tony, but now she was stuck in a dangerous web of lies. If she didn't figure out who the traitor was soon, it could mean the end of everything. The question now wasn't whether she could fool Tony. It was whether she could stay alive long enough to bring him down. Back at the police station, Frankie paced in the small room. Every minute felt like an hour, and every second stretched out in a never-ending nightmare. He had no idea if Marie had made it into Tony's world, or if she had already been caught. Then, just as he was starting to lose hope, his phone buzzed. A text message from Marie. "I'm in, but this is bigger than we thought. I need more time." Frankie's heart skipped a beat. This was it. Marie was playing the dangerous game, and now it was up to them to make sure she didn't lose. But just as he was about to respond, he heard a voice behind him. Detective Jameson had entered the room, his face grim. "You're going to need to prepare yourself, Malone," Jameson said quietly. "Things are about to get a lot worse." Frankie felt his blood run cold. What was Jameson talking about? What did he mean by worse? Before he could ask, the phone in Jameson's hand rang. The detective answered it, his face hardening as he listened. "Get everyone ready," he muttered. "This is going to blow wide open." The fear inside Frankie grew. What was happening now? And was Marie going to make it out alive? Frankie's mind raced as Detective Jameson hung up the phone. The fear that had been gnawing at him since Marie had left to infiltrate Tony's operation grew stronger with every passing second. Jameson's somber expression said it all. Things were spiraling out of control. "What's going on, Jameson?" Frankie asked, his voice tight with urgency. "What's happening?" Jameson didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow breath and then looked Frankie dead in the eyes. "Tony's operation is bigger than we thought. We've been getting reports of a mole in our own department. Someone's feeding him information." Frankie's heart sank. He had suspected that Tony had inside sources, but now the police were compromised? This was worse than he could have imagined. How could they stop Tony if the people they were working with couldn't be trusted? "Who?" Frankie demanded. "Who's the traitor?" Jameson ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. "We don't know yet. We've got a few leads, but we're still piecing things together. But one thing's for sure. If Tony's got someone on the inside, he's one step ahead of us." Frankie clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "What does this mean for Marie?" Jameson's face softened, but his eyes were still serious. "It means everything just got a lot more dangerous for her. If Tony knows we're onto him, he won't hesitate to act. He'll think she's part of the plan to bring him down, and that means he won't be merciful." Frankie's mind spun. He had to find a way to get to Marie before Tony did. Time was running out. If Tony was already onto her, she might already be in more trouble than she realized. "I need to find her. Now," Frankie said, already heading for the door. Jameson grabbed his arm, stopping him. "You're not going anywhere. Not yet. You've got to stay focused. We need a plan." But Frankie wasn't listening. He yanked his arm out of Jameson's grip and stormed out of the room, ignoring the detective's protests. He didn't care about plans. He didn't care about the police. All he cared about was Marie, and he couldn't let her face Tony alone. Marie's heart hammered in her chest as she stood in Tony's private office. The tension in the room was thick, and she could feel Tony's cold eyes on her, studying every move she made. He was waiting for her to make a mistake, waiting for her to slip up so he could strike. She had no idea how long she could keep up the charade. Every moment felt like it could be her last. But she had to do this. For Frankie. For herself. Tony leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. "So, tell me, Marie, what have you been up to while I've been out of the picture? I want to know what you've been doing behind my back." Marie swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. "I've been thinking about things, Tony. About what I want. And I've realized that you're the only one who can give me what I need. You've always had control, and I want that again. I'm here because I know where I belong." Tony narrowed his eyes, clearly not convinced. "You better be telling the truth, or I'll make sure you regret it." Marie's stomach churned, but she nodded, forcing a smile. "I'm telling the truth, Tony. I'm not going anywhere." For a long moment, Tony didn't say anything. He just stared at her, his piercing gaze making her feel like she was trapped in a cage. She had to keep going. She had to prove her loyalty. "I'm not sure," Tony said finally, his voice low. "There's something off about you. Maybe you've been lying to me this whole time. Maybe you've been working with the cops." Marie's breath caught in her throat. Her worst fear had just been voiced aloud. Tony suspected her. He suspected her loyalty wasn't real. Tony stood up abruptly, walking over to a nearby shelf and pulling out a stack of papers. "I've got something for you to do," he said, tossing the papers onto the desk in front of her. "I need you to find out who's been talking to the cops. Someone's been leaking information. It's time for you to show me you're still useful." Marie's hands trembled as she reached for the papers. Her mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan. She had no choice. She had to find the mole and make it look like she was doing Tony's bidding. But how could she betray someone she didn't even know? And worse, how could she survive if she got caught in the middle of this dangerous game? Just as she was about to respond, a sharp knock sounded at the door. Tony's eyes flashed with suspicion. Who the hell is that? Before Marie could answer, the door opened, and one of Tony's men stepped in, looking frantic. "Boss, we've got a problem. There's been a leak. Someone's been talking. We need to deal with this fast." Tony's face darkened, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Get out. I'll handle it." Marie's stomach tightened as Tony dismissed his man and turned his full attention back to her. She had no idea what was going on, but she knew it was bad. Tony wasn't just upset. He was dangerous when he felt threatened. He stepped closer to her, his gaze intense. "You think you can lie to me? You think you can fool me? I'm done playing games. Now you're going to prove your loyalty, or I'll make sure you regret ever crossing me." Marie's pulse raced as she fought to keep her composure. She had to do something. She had to act fast. "Tony, I'm with you," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I'm loyal. I'll find out who's been talking. I'll make sure they pay." Tony studied her for a long moment, his face hard. Then, finally, he nodded. "Good. You better make sure you get results, or I'll make sure you're the one who regrets it." Marie felt a chill run down her spine. She had just agreed to do something she didn't know how to fix. If she failed, she might never see Frankie again. If she succeeded, well, then maybe they could bring Tony down. But how could she make sure everything didn't blow up in her face? Back at the police station, Frankie was pacing again, his mind spinning. He couldn't sit still. He had to know what was going on with Marie. Was she really with Tony? Or had she been caught? His phone buzzed again, and his heart skipped a beat. It was a message from Marie. "I'm in. I've got the job. But Tony knows something's off. We don't have much time." Frankie's hands shook as he read the message. Tony was onto her. That meant they were running out of time. He had to move fast. Without thinking, Frankie grabbed his coat and headed for the door. He didn't know what he was going to do next, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let Tony win, and he wasn't going to let Marie fall into his trap. Not without a fight. The cold night air hit Frankie as he stepped out of the police station, his breath coming out in sharp, anxious puffs. He didn't have a plan. He didn't even know exactly where Tony's operation was, but one thing was clear. Marie was deep in it now, and every second that ticked by brought her closer to danger. His phone buzzed again, and he nearly dropped it. Another message from Marie. He quickly unlocked it, his fingers trembling. "I'm doing what Tony wants, but I'm getting deeper into this. You need to be ready. Don't trust anyone. Someone's feeding information to him." Frankie felt his heart drop. He had suspected there was a mole in the police department, but now it seemed like they were more compromised than he had thought. If there was a rat in their midst, there was no telling what kind of damage it could cause. His mind was in chaos. He wanted to rush straight to Tony's hideout, find Marie, and get her out. But the risk of walking into a trap was enormous. Tony was smart, and he would be watching for any sign of betrayal. "Think, Frankie," he muttered under his breath. He couldn't just go charging in. He had to be smart. He had to use whatever leverage he had, even if it meant playing Tony's dangerous game for just a little longer. Meanwhile, Marie was alone in a small, dimly lit room at Tony's hideout. She had spent hours searching through the files Tony had given her, but all she could find were leads that didn't make sense. There were too many names, too many connections, and nothing that pointed directly to the mole. The pressure was unbearable. She could feel Tony's eyes on her, even when he wasn't around, and she knew she had to find something soon, or her loyalty would be questioned. She rubbed her forehead, trying to think. She had promised Tony she would get results, but she didn't even know where to start. Was there anyone she could trust inside Tony's circle? Or was everyone out for their own survival? The door creaked open, and Marie quickly hid the papers she had been looking through. One of Tony's men stepped inside, looking as cold as ever. "Tony wants to see you," he said, his tone flat and unfeeling. Now, Marie's heart skipped a beat. Had she done something wrong? Had Tony finally figured out that she was stalling? "Okay," she said quietly, standing up. "I'm coming." The man didn't say another word as he led her through the winding halls of the hideout. Every step felt heavier than the last, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. Was this the moment Tony would expose her for the fraud she was? Would she be dragged out of the hideout and thrown to the wolves? When they finally reached Tony's office, the man knocked once and then opened the door. Inside, Tony was sitting at his desk, papers spread out in front of him, looking every bit the ruthless mob boss he was. Marie stepped in and closed the door behind her, her stomach churning. She had no idea what Tony wanted from her now, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't getting out of this without a fight. "Sit down," Tony said, his voice calm, almost too calm. Marie did as instructed, sitting in the chair across from his desk. Tony looked at her for a long moment, his eyes piercing through her. She could feel his suspicion in the air, thick and suffocating. "I've been thinking," Tony said slowly, "and I've come to a conclusion. You've been too quiet lately, Marie. I'm starting to wonder if you've been playing me all along." Marie's heart skipped a beat. This was it. He was going to turn on her. She could feel it. "Tony, I swear," she started, but he raised a hand, silencing her. "No need for the lies," he said sharply. "I've got eyes everywhere. People have been talking, and I don't like what I'm hearing. You've been with me long enough to know that I don't tolerate betrayal." Marie swallowed hard, trying to keep her composure. "I haven't betrayed you, Tony. I'm here because I want to help you. I've always been loyal." Tony leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Loyalty is earned, Marie. And right now, you've got a lot of proving to do. I'm giving you one chance to show me that you're still on my side." Marie nodded, trying to steady her breathing. "Tell me what you need." Tony smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that sent chills down her spine. "I've got a little task for you. I need you to find out who's been talking to the cops, who's been leaking information to them. I'm trusting you with this, Marie. Don't disappoint me." Marie's stomach dropped. This was the moment she had been dreading. She had no idea who the mole was, but now Tony was trusting her to find them. If she failed, well, she didn't want to think about the consequences. "I'll do it," she said, her voice shaky but determined. "I'll find the rat." Tony's smile grew wider, but there was no warmth in it. "Good. You better. I'll be keeping an eye on you." As Marie left the office, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to spiral out of control. Tony's grip on her was tightening, and she had no idea how to escape without putting herself in even more danger. Back in the city, Frankie was growing more desperate by the minute. He knew he had to act quickly, but every move he made seemed to bring him closer to Tony's radar. His phone buzzed again, and he snatched it up, praying for good news. It was another text from Marie. "I'm being watched. Tony wants me to find the mole. He's getting suspicious. I don't have much time." Frankie's heart skipped a beat. Time was running out. Tony was too dangerous, and Marie was walking a fine line between loyalty and betrayal. "I've got to find a way in," Frankie muttered, pacing back and forth. "I've got to get to her before it's too late." He quickly texted back, "Stay strong. I'm coming for you. Just hang on." But deep down, he knew the danger they were in was far worse than he had imagined. Tony was getting smarter. He was closing in, and Frankie had no idea how he was going to stop it before everything they'd fought for crumbled to dust. As Marie sat in her room, staring at the list of names she had pulled from Tony's files, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to make a terrible mistake. The walls were closing in on her. She had agreed to find the mole, but she didn't even know where to begin. But before she could think any further, there was a knock at the door. She jumped, heart racing. It was Tony's man again. "Boss wants you," he said flatly. Marie's blood ran cold. Was it time? Was she about to face the consequences for everything she had done? She had no choice but to follow. The game was far from over, and now, everything was hanging by a thread. Marie's legs felt like lead as she followed Tony's man down the dark hallway. Every step seemed heavier than the last, and the knot in her stomach tightened. She couldn't keep pretending for much longer. Tony was closing in, and the game she was playing had no clear end. As they reached Tony's office, the man stopped and knocked once before opening the door. Marie stepped inside, her heart thundering in her chest. Tony was sitting behind his massive desk, his hands steepled in front of him, his expression cold and unreadable. He didn't look up when she entered, and for a brief moment, she thought he might be angry. But then he spoke. "Marie," he said, his voice smooth but edged with something dangerous. "I'm giving you a chance to prove your loyalty. This mole business, it's bigger than you think. It's not just about protecting me. It's about sending a message. Do you understand?" Marie nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Yes, Tony, I understand." Tony's eyes flicked to the side, as though he were considering something. He finally looked up at her, his gaze sharp and calculating. I've made arrangements for you to meet someone tonight. He's the one who has the answers you're looking for. Marie's brow furrowed. Who is he? Tony didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood up and walked over to a small safe behind his desk. He entered the combination, and when the door swung open, he pulled out a folder and tossed it onto the desk. This is a man I trust, Tony said, his voice low. His name is Salvatore. He knows things. Things about the cops, about the mole in my organization. He's been working with me for a long time, and now he's your job. Marie's pulse quickened. She didn't know how much of this was true. She couldn't afford to trust anyone in Tony's world, but something about the way Tony spoke made her uneasy. There was a darkness to his words, a sense that he was preparing her for something far worse than she had imagined. What am I supposed to do with him? She asked carefully. Tony's smile was all teeth. You're going to get the answers you need from him. If you can't, well, I'm sure you know what happens next. Marie's breath caught in her throat. He wasn't just testing her loyalty. He was giving her a task she couldn't fail. If she didn't get the answers Tony wanted, she would be the one to pay the price. But what if she couldn't get anything from Salvatore? What if he didn't have the information Tony needed? I'll do it, Marie said, her voice trembling slightly. I'll find out what I need to know. Tony gave a slow nod. Good. And remember, Marie, if you fail, it won't just be you who suffers. The weight of his words hung in the air as Marie turned to leave. She had no choice but to comply. She didn't know who this Salvatore was, or what information he could possibly have, but there was no turning back now. Meanwhile, Frankie had been working frantically, trying to find any lead that could help him locate Marie before it was too late. The tension between the police and Tony's men was growing, and Frankie knew they didn't have much time left. Every moment spent in the dark was a moment that could cost Marie her life. He had tried reaching out to Detective Jameson, but he hadn't heard from him all day. He had a bad feeling about it. If Jameson was involved in the leak, it could explain why things had gone so wrong so quickly. As Frankie stared at his phone, trying to think of his next move, his phone buzzed again. He almost jumped out of his seat when he saw the message. I'm meeting someone tonight. His name's Salvatore. I don't trust him, but it's my only shot. I'll keep you posted. Be ready. Frankie's heart stopped. This was it. Marie was meeting someone who could be tied to the mole. It was his only chance to get to her before Tony did something unforgivable. He quickly texted back, I'll be there. Don't do anything until I get there. I'm not letting you face this alone. But as soon as he hit send, a sharp knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Frankie, a familiar voice called from the other side. It was Detective Jameson. Frankie froze. What was he doing here? And why now, of all times? Come in, Frankie said, his voice cautious. The door creaked open, and Jameson stepped inside. He was acting strange, tense, like he had something to hide. Frankie immediately noticed the hard look in his eyes. Jameson, what's going on? I need you to be honest with me. Are you in on this? Are you working with Tony? Frankie's voice was tight, full of suspicion. Jameson didn't answer right away. He just stood there, looking at Frankie with a blank expression. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice low. I'm trying to protect you, Malone, he said. And I'm trying to protect Marie. I've been trying to get to her before Tony does something worse. Frankie's mind raced. Protect him? Protect Marie? What was Jameson talking about? What do you mean? I'm already trying to protect her. She's meeting someone tonight, someone named Salvatore. I need to get to her before things go sideways. Jameson's face tightened at the mention of Salvatore's name. You're too late. I've been tracking her, Frankie. She's already in Tony's hands. And the meeting with Salvatore isn't just some casual conversation. You're walking into something bigger than you know. Frankie's heart sank. What are you saying, Jameson? What's going on? Jameson exhaled sharply. There's a mole. A cop who's been working for Tony. And we've been trying to catch him. But if you go after Marie without knowing who it is, you could walk straight into a trap. It's more dangerous than you think. Frankie was reeling. He had suspected there was a mole, but now Jameson was telling him he might be walking right into Tony's snare. Who is it, Jameson? Frankie demanded. Who's the mole? Jameson's eyes flicked to the side, his face tightening. I can't tell you. Not yet. But if you want to get Marie out of this alive, you need to trust me. Don't go after her tonight. I'll handle it. Frankie's blood ran cold. You expect me to just sit back while Marie's life is on the line? Do you want her to live, or do you want to make things worse? Jameson snapped back. We're running out of time, and I'm trying to keep you both alive. Trust me, Frankie. Frankie stood there, frozen, the weight of Jameson's words settling heavily on his chest. He didn't know what to believe anymore. The lines were blurred. He had no idea who he could trust. But one thing was for sure. He wasn't backing down now. He had to get to Marie. And no matter who was working with Tony, no matter what secrets were lurking in the dark, Frankie was going to do whatever it took to get her out of this nightmare. Marie arrived at the meeting spot, her pulse racing. She had no idea what to expect from Salvador, but she knew one thing. This was her only shot at getting out of Tony's grip. She had to get something, anything, that would give her an advantage. As she walked down the alley, she saw a shadow move in the darkness. A man stepped forward, tall and broad-shouldered, his face hidden by the brim of a cap. Are you Salvatore? Marie asked, her voice steady despite the nerves that were threatening to overtake her. The man's eyes glinted in the dim light. I am, and I know why you're here. Marie felt a chill run down her spine. What had she walked into? The cold wind sliced through the alley as Marie stood face to face with Salvatore. His presence was imposing, his silence unnerving. She could barely make out his features under the shadow of his cap, but the way he stood, relaxed but dangerous, told her everything she needed to know. He was not someone she could take lightly. You're Tony's girl, right? Salvatore's voice was rough, the kind of gravelly sound that seemed to belong to someone who had seen far too much of the darker side of life. Marie hesitated, unsure of what to say. Was this the moment she had been waiting for? Or was this just another trap set by Tony to see if she would crack? I am, she replied, keeping her voice steady. I'm here because Tony sent me. He wants answers. I need to know who the mole is. Salvatore's lips curled into a grin, but there was nothing warm about it. You think Tony's going to let you walk away with that kind of information? You've got to be out of your mind, sweetheart. Marie's heart raced. The pressure was on her now. She couldn't back down. Not now. Not when everything was so close. I'm not here for a chat, Salvatore, she said, her voice firmer this time. I'm here to do business. Either you give me the information, or I'll find a way to get it another way. Salvatore let out a low laugh, the sound echoing off the brick walls. You're tough. I'll give you that. But there's a price for everything, sweetheart. You can't just waltz in here and expect me to hand over what Tony wants. Marie narrowed her eyes. Then what do you want? Salvatore's grin widened. You think Tony doesn't have spies? You think he's not already watching everything you do? You're playing a dangerous game, and I don't think you're ready for the stakes. You need to prove yourself to me, not Tony. You've been playing the role of the good little assistant, but I don't buy it. Not for a second. Marie's stomach twisted. She had known this wasn't going to be easy, but Salvatore's words hit harder than she expected. Tony had eyes everywhere, even on her. She had thought she could keep playing both sides, keep Tony thinking she was loyal while secretly helping Frankie. But now, Salvador was calling her out. And if she didn't act fast, everything she had worked for would fall apart. I'm not here to waste time, Marie said, the edge in her voice sharpening. Give me the information, or I'll walk. And I'll go straight to Tony with what I know. If you think you can get away with this, you're wrong. Salvatore studied her for a long moment, his gaze piercing. Then, finally, he nodded. Fine. You want the mole? I'll tell you what I know. But there's a condition. Marie's heart skipped a beat. What condition? You need to prove your loyalty to me first, Salvatore said, his voice cold. I'm not just going to hand over information to someone I don't trust. You want Tony's mole? You've got to show me you can handle the truth. Marie's hands tightened into fists. This wasn't just about the mole anymore. It was a game, and Salvatore was trying to test her, push her further into the hole she was already in. I don't have time for games, she said, her teeth clenched. Tell me what I need to do. Salvatore took a step closer, his eyes darkening. You're not in control here, sweetheart. I am. And if you want to walk away with that information, you need to prove you can do whatever it takes. You've been pretending to be Tony's loyal little assistant, but I know better. You've got a choice. Prove to me that you're willing to go further than you've ever gone before, or you walk away empty-handed. Your call. Marie felt a lump form in her throat. What was he asking? What was the price of the truth? As she stood there, trapped between Salvatore's cold eyes and the ever-present shadow of Tony's world, Marie felt her world spinning. She had already crossed so many lines. She had already done things she would never have imagined, and now this? Now Salvatore wanted to test her loyalty, to push her even further into the darkness? But what other choice did she have? Tell me what to do, Marie said through gritted teeth. She had no more options. No more time. She had to take this risk, even if it meant losing herself in the process. Salvatore gave a sly smile, as if he had been waiting for her to say those words. Good. Then here's the deal. There's a man in Tony's operation, someone Tony trusts. His name is Lucas. He's been feeding information to the cops for months, and Tony's been too blind to see it. He's the one you're looking for. Marie's blood ran cold at the mention of Lucas. She had known that there was a mole, but this was a whole different level. Lucas was one of Tony's most trusted men. If he was the mole, it meant everything was worse than she thought. But here's the thing, Salvatore continued, his tone darkening. Lucas isn't just any informant. He's Tony's right-hand man. If you want to take him down, you'll have to make Tony believe it was someone else. And you'll have to make sure Lucas doesn't have a chance to escape. If you screw this up, it's over for you. Marie felt a chill sweep through her. This was it. The point of no return. She had been given the truth, but it came with a price she wasn't sure she could pay. I'll do it, she said, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her heart. Salvatore nodded. Good. Now, you've got to move fast. Tony's already getting suspicious. You've got to make sure Lucas is out of the picture before it's too late. And remember, you're playing a dangerous game. One wrong move, and it's over for both you and Frankie. Marie's stomach twisted again. Frankie, the man she had promised to help, the man she had tried to protect. But now, it seemed like she was just one more pawn in Tony's game. She turned to leave, but before she could take another step, Salvatore's voice stopped her. Oh, and Marie, he called. You're not the only one trying to play both sides. Be careful who you trust. The words hung in the air as Marie stepped into the night, her mind spinning. She had the information. She had the truth. But now, everything depended on how she used it. Could she take down Lucas and Tony without losing everything? Could she still save herself and Frankie from this mess? The path ahead was darker than she could have ever imagined, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep pretending she was still in control. But one thing was certain, she couldn't stop now. The game was far from over.